Hi, I'm Meghan Murphy, the Schwarzman Fellow at the Asia Society Policy Institute here in New York. Today I'm delighted to be in conversation with Sean Turnell, an economist focused on Myanmar and a fellow at the Lowy Institute in Sydney. Sean, welcome. It's truly an honor to have you with us.
Thank you, Megan. It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
And so a little bit of background on Sean for those who don't know him. Sean has worked as a professor of economics at Macquarie University and the Reserve Bank of Australia. And from 2016 to 2021, Sean served as the senior economic advisor to Aung San Suu Kyi's democratically elected government. Following the military coup in 2021, Sean was arrested and imprisoned for 2 years alongside members of the democratic government. He was released in 2021 and has since come out with a book detailing his experiences called An Unlikely Prisoner, which we have here today, as well as a report on the economic reforms he made in Myanmar titled The Best Laid Plans. So to begin, I would love to start sort of with an overview of your background and how you came to be in Myanmar.
Totally by accident, which is, I think, how people usually encounter Myanmar. And then they fall in love with the place and it pulls them in. So mine was the classic story like that. A century ago, when I was doing my PhD, I lived in a share house of other PhD students, one of whom was one of the granddaughters of one of the 30 Comrades,
Wow.
the fabled group who brought, Myanmar's independence. And her and her family had actually fled Australia in the first military coup in the 1960s. And she sort of got all the rest of the household really interested in Burma. And we would go to demonstrations, we would eat Burmese food. And so I fell in love with it, almost from the get-go. But then they found out I was an economist. So this is the early 1990s. And I gradually helped people in the democracy movement with economic stuff. We had an idea that economics could be a new front through which we could critique the military regime and sort of try and push the forces of democracy.
Mm-hmm. Great. So you've been working as an economic advisor for about 5 years when the Tatmadaw, or the junta, took over in February 2021. And as you detail in your book, you were arrested at your hotel just a few days after the coup. So I'd like to talk a little bit about your time in detention before we get into the fun economic policy questions. So you mentioned in your book that while you were in prison, you decided that you were going to write a book about the experiences. What was it like trying to remember everything that was happening to you while you were experiencing it when you had no way to record the things you were seeing and feeling?
So it's really interesting what your mind can do when really pushed. So memorising what I wanted to write in a subsequent book was how I also stayed alive, how I kept my mind active above all, keep panic at bay and sort of just place my mind somewhere else. So as I say this right now, it sounds incredibly difficult. How do you construct and then memorise a book? And I did it cumulatively. I would think of the introduction and I would think of, chapter 1 and chapter 2, and every day I would repeat the previous day's writing in my head. So, in other words, it sort of just became this longer and longer thing to remember day after day. But my mind just adapted to it, 2 years since being released, my memory is, as it was, almost nothing. But in that detention time, in the prison, my mind became almost savant-like. It's really bizarre. It seems unbelievable to, even as I'm saying it now. But at the time, my mind became incredibly sharp. And I think it's because I had nothing to distract me. I had no mobile phones or anything like that, no internet, no emails, nothing. So, really cast upon my own resources. So integral to my survival strategy. But I just found that my brain, if you like, responded to the circumstances. But it did mean then when I got back to Australia after being released, I then quickly got some paper and just started writing down, all the things that were in my head before I forgot it.
Wow. So in the book, you reveal a lot of the secrets of the infamous insane prison. You talk about the black market and officers that are drunk. At any point, did you worry that writing about what was going on in these prisons would in some way affect the people who remained there by revealing anything that was going on?
I sure did. One of the things I did while I was in the prison, because I always intended to write the book, of course, and so people who I knew I would like to mention, I actually asked their permission. In fact, on numerous occasions, so many times, in fact, that they said, Sean, yeah, it's okay. We said it's okay. Very, very conscious of that, particularly with respect to my fellow political prisoners. Likewise, though, some of the better guards and better police and so on. I made some subtle changes to sort of hide their identity. A very conscious thing to not create further distress to people who are in prison.
Absolutely. And you talk about, although you weren't housed in the same cell or in the same block as Aung San Suu Kyi, as Da Suu, that she was in the same prison as you. I wonder, she'd spent decades in house arrest, much of her life has experienced imprisonment. Did you draw upon anything that she had told you about staying strong through those periods of her life while you were imprisoned for 2 years?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I think I did implicitly because I'd read all of her books and so on. And then, of course, I used to see her once a week for our trial day. And so I drew immediate strength from her and, her coping strategy in real time, if you like. But I think it's a great question because I think I did draw upon her memoirs written many years ago in her first manifestation of being in prison. So, yeah, I think I did, as well as other things that I'd read as a kid. As a teenager, I was addicted to prisoner of war stories and all that. So I drew upon that. But I do think that Daw Suu's story was, integral to it as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. And what is the most recent update on her situation? Is she still remaining in the same place that you left her?
That's as I understand it, yeah. The regime has made some comments to suggest that she's in better circumstances and somehow in some form of house arrest. But my understanding is that that is not true and that she's in the prison where I was with her and the conditions there are really awful. They're awful for anyone, let alone a lady who's about to turn 80. So I know I'm not alone in really worrying about her.
Absolutely. And you mentioned in the book that one of the things that the government did by keeping her in Naypyidaw was using her as a human shield. What are the risks of continuing conflict on her and other prisoners' safety? Could, they potentially become a source, a battlefield of such with the forces coming into the region?
It's really interesting because I'd never really thought about it. When I was first told that she was still there in that prison in Naypyidaw, I just thought they were trying to punish her and so on. And then a Burmese friend said to me, no, hang on, this is about being a human shield because the regime is terribly worried. They're falling apart, as we know, and there have been attacks in the citadel of Naypyidaw. And so by drawing Daw Suu, as well as the arrested president, U Win Myint, by drawing them close to the military leadership, I think they hope to protect themselves, understanding that the resistance may not attack them in order to avoid hurting her or the president. So it's an awful situation, and it just adds, I think, to the many crimes being committed by this regime.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So to transition a bit to some policy questions, I want to go back to before the coup and talk about the conditions that led to what happened in February 2021. As you mentioned and as we know, the military had never fully ceded control to the NLD or to Aung San Suu Kyi's rule. But what triggered the action in February 2021?
So I think that there's a number of things. One, a very personal thing relating to the Commander-in-Chief, Min Aung Hlaing, who is now the junta chief, of course, and is this head of state. He was coming up to retirement. He'd been Commander-in-Chief for a long time and, of course, in that role had committed terrible atrocities right throughout Myanmar, but most famously in Rakhine State against the Rohingya. So he was incredibly vulnerable to the rage of the international community on that score, and he was terribly worried that he was going to be dragged off to The Hague to face trial at the International Criminal Court. He hadn't been up until that point because of his very key role in Myanmar, but I think he was starting to worry that if he retired, then the civilian government might just conclude that it'd be better to hand him over to the International Criminal Court. So I think that anxiety festered with him. And you can actually see it in some of his pronouncements and so on, and that suspicion and hostility towards the civilian government. So I think his personal circumstances were one critical trigger. I think a second trigger, though, funnily enough, was the very success of the reforms, because part of the reform program was deliberately to try and open up Myanmar, to break up the monopolies, to break up the crony enterprises, the military companies, and make Myanmar a competitive, open, accountable sort of country. But that, of course, meant that those very policies, those reforms, made some very powerful enemies. And so in those months leading into the coup, we could feel the tension rising. And even personally, I received a number of threats, particularly from some bankers, some crony bankers, that basically said, you guys are going too much, stop. And then famously or infamously to me, one senior banker said to me, Sean, if we go down, you're all going down with us. Wow. So you can feel that sort of background tension just rising, particularly over that last 6 months.
Yeah, so you mentioned a backlash to the success. So part of the success of opening up was that a lot of countries had lifted sanctions on Myanmar following Aung San Suu Kyi's rise to power and democratization. The Obama administration, famously in 2016, lifted a majority of U.S. sanctions on Myanmar. Knowing what you know now about the coup and that part of it was a pushback to the success, should those sanctions have been lifted?
Really interesting question. And I don't have a definite answer to it. One part of me thinks yes, they should have been lifted. It helped with the reform program. And when the narrative was good about Myanmar, I think it helped that there wasn't this, this area that might have kept foreign investors out and all of that. However, and on the other hand, to sound like an economist, it should have been clearer, not only I think to the international community, but to people like myself as well, just how much this really was an incomplete transition. I mean, I think intellectually we realised it, but over time, our behaviour, that just the way we pushed things forward and continued on, I think we sort of forgot, actually, just how much power the military continued to have, even though, again, I mentioned about rising tension, but, tensions were there pretty much throughout the whole period. So, we did receive any number of reminders that the military were there and so on. But I think you sort of got used to it after a while and sort of forgot about that. So, so my answer on that is a little bit divided. I can see arguments both sides. It would have been good at one level to have attention on those bad actors all the way through. But on the other hand, it would have spoiled the narrative, I suppose, of what we were trying to do in those very hopeful days.
You mentioned the hopeful days, and that's definitely what it was in 2016. There was an immense hope for the country, and the international community was very supportive. But some of that support, as you mentioned, had slipped after the military crackdown in Rakhine State, leading many in the international community to accuse both the military and the NLD government of ethnic cleansing. Do you think there would have been a stronger and more cohesive international response to the 2021 coup if the NLD government had been more charitable and openly supportive of the Rohingya in years prior?
Yeah, so it was easily the worst episode of the civilian government, and they made a number of mistakes, many of which we knew at the time, and there was lots of divided opinion within the civilian government of how to respond to the military's atrocities. Some of them have become much more clearer after the event. So I think, for instance, right now, it's very clear that the reduction in the status, the fall in the status of Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD government was probably part of the trigger again for the coup, because what it effectively did, of course, was to lower the price. Min Aung Hlaing could proceed and understand that the reaction of the international community would be much less than it would have been, when the NLD and Daw Suu's star was really riding high. So, it was just a terrible episode all round. And as I said, lots of mistakes were made, particularly, in fact, you alluded to this about the communications aspect, because, of course, the atrocities themselves were completely out of the hands of the civilian government. They had no control over the military or any of the security agencies, but they did mishandle the communications. I think they needed to come out much stronger earlier. I think the tactic, the strategy, if you like, was to try and have the military dependent on the civilian government. In other words, redress the power imbalance and allow, if you like, the civilian government to try and have influence over the military and try to get them to stop. A political calculation that I think now we understand was the wrong one. In my view, having spoken to Aung San Suu Kyi about it, at the time and subsequently in the prison, as well as other senior people, I'm convinced that while it was a political mistake, it wasn't a moral mistake as such, in the sense that for people like Daw Suu and some of the other senior NLD people, they were horrified with what was going on and tried a lot of things behind the scenes, some of which I was actually involved with, to do with, financial actions against the military. But there were other things as well. So I don't think they morally failed, if you like, but I think in the way that they tried to redress the balance, tried to rein the military in, I think they made some miscalculations of just how ruthless the military was. I think they overestimated the sway that they might have over the military, which, turned out to be wrong after February 2021.
Yeah, so you mentioned communications could have been different. For example, Aung San Suu Kyi testifying at the ICC in behalf of the military. Is that something she could have avoided, or were her hands completely tied?
I think so. Again, though, I think it was part of that miscalculation, but a well-intentioned miscalculation, in that it was part of that story of making the military more dependent, more in the debt of the civilian government, that, if there was to be a good outcome for them personally, it depended on the civilian government. Yeah, as I say, I think that was a miscalculation. It's interesting, that whole episode involving the ICJ, because one of the interesting things to do is, if you have a look at what Aung San Suu Kyi actually said, that's actually much stronger in condemning the military than what people remember it. But the trouble was, of course, people don't remember what she actually said. It was her appearance at the ICJ, what looked like defending the military, even though, as I say, verbally, if you look at it, what she said was pretty okay. But the appearance of it, I think, was really unfortunate. And that was the gamble that she took. In my view, it was the wrong one. But, as I say, and having spoken at length about it to her, it was a well-intentioned one in my view.
Sort of the last thing I'll ask on this topic before we talk more about the economy. Do you feel that the sort of fall from grace in the international system regarding the Rohingya crisis, did that complicate efforts for your release? Did it make it harder because you maybe had this association with a leader that was no longer as revered?
I think so. And I think in a broader sense, though, in which the whole issue of Myanmar then became much more problematic. And then, with the various events in Ukraine and all the, chaos around the world, it became easier just to ignore Myanmar. Because before it was so clear, right? It was so clear who the guys in the black hats were, who the goodies were. Suddenly it was a much more nuanced story, and all too difficult, I think, for many people in the international community. So I think a lot of them just stopped paying attention to Myanmar after the coup. So and I think that bounced back on me, but much more, I think, Aung San Suu Kyi herself, as well as some other political prisoners.
Yeah, well, hopefully what your presence here can do and your trip to the States is to refocus attention on Myanmar. So to talk more about your specialty, you're an economist, an expert on Myanmar's economy. Could you give us an overview of the state of Myanmar's economy right now? And how exactly is the junta still in power? How are they still funding their war?
So the state of the economy, in a word, is catastrophic. I mean, it is just extraordinary. So GDP, the true measure of economic activity, is only 50% what very conservative projections suggest it should be in 2025. Even in absolute terms, it's about 20% below what it was in 2019. And of course, Myanmar is already one of the poorest countries in Southeast Asia. In fact, now it's very much the poorest by a big margin. So it's just been catastrophic. So people's incomes just destroyed, whole industries destroyed. You know, tourism, for instance, stands out, which was something we'd put huge focus on, you know. But yeah, many other industries as well. The country's under sanction, but you know the sanctions are sort of just the icing on the cake. The damage done to the economy by Min Aung Hlaing and the SAC junta's mismanagement of the economy is just extraordinary. So highest inflation in the region. The government funds itself just simply by printing money. There's nothing in the way of health policy, education policy, investment policy, infrastructure policy, all that out the window. The structural reforms just gone. Myanmar is now little more than a subsistence economy, people just barely surviving. To the extent that the regime has an economic policy, it's really just let's try and grab as much foreign exchange as we can from exporters. Let's grab the remittances of foreign workers abroad because, of course, the regime desperately needs foreign exchange to pay for the advanced weaponry that they need and which is not made in Myanmar. So that really is simply their only economic policy. And as a consequence, yeah, the economy is just in this terrible state.
So it is in this terrible state and has been for some time, but via what indicators and at what point is the regime literally going to be too broke to continue holding power?
Yeah. It's a great question because, so here's the problem for the rest of us. It's true that their management of the economy has been catastrophic. So by any normal measure, you would think that they would be gone. Like you would think that they would, you know, senior people in the leadership would be trying to throw over the regime or whatever. It just doesn't make any sense. But the problem is this, that given that their only focus now is on regime survival. Their only economic policy, grabbing the foreign exchange, as I mentioned, to enable that survival. If that's what you do, if you just narrow down and you don't care about all the other stuff that we normally expect a government to do, you can actually survive for a long time because, you know, you've sort of like withdrawn into a tight shell. You don't really have to care about all these nuances in the economy. You just need to concentrate on getting the resources to continue the fight. And that's unfortunately where we are. You know, there's this rump junta that's bent on its own survival, immense suffering around that. But yeah, it can really just continue on for a long time or can collapse really quickly, depending if those resources are cut off. So very strange situation at the moment.
Yeah. And now we can turn a bit to sanctions. You've mentioned that there are still ways for the junta to get foreign exchange. You've written about in your most recent report with the Lowy Institute and other writings about the Central Bank of Myanmar. So what specific sanctions would you suggest that could close some of those loopholes?
So I think the sanctions that are needed above all are financial sanctions because there's almost money, foreign exchange and weaponry are almost synonyms now. So cutting off the foreign exchange is equivalent to cutting off the advanced weaponry that the junta uses to stay in control. So yeah, it's to go for the finances. Now the good news on that front is that countries like the United States, but especially the USA, have got some really good sanctions in place already. So the US, for instance, sanctions two of the big state-owned banks that used to be the major sources of foreign exchange of the regime. They seized the assets of the central bank a few days after the coup. Fantastic move by the US Federal Reserve. But, of course, this regime is very cunning. In many other ways, they're not very sophisticated. They're very unworldly, but they have a certain rat cunning when it comes to their own resources. So they've been able to use some other state-owned banks and even some private banks to try and evade the sanctions. So one of the things I'm calling for is for those gaps to be closed. Some of it involves the US. So, for instance, the US, I think, needs to extend sanctions to another big state-owned bank called the Myanmar Economic Bank. But then also the other countries need to help the US, basically. So particularly Asian countries, countries like my own country of Australia, the rest of the West, the G7, in just closing off those loopholes and starving the regime of the foreign exchange that it so desperately needs.
Yeah, so let's talk about some of those other countries. I'm particularly interested in China. They have a very complex relationship with Myanmar, but nevertheless has a pull with the military leaders that no other country really has. What should and what reasonably could China be doing differently to end this crisis?
Yeah, China's role is critical. And recently they've helped the regime come back from the brink. A few months ago, the regime looked like it was about to disappear any moment. There'd been huge victories by the democratic resistance to them, and they looked really in trouble. And then China seems to have suddenly realised this and thrown their support behind them. China's relationship is very complex, but in its essence, China basically exploits Myanmar. So China wants a stable Myanmar, but it wants a weak Myanmar. So it wants a Myanmar that is a place to extract natural resources. So a vast proportion of the rare earths, for instance, that China processes comes from Myanmar. That's one thing. But there's all sorts of other raw materials, gas, all sorts of other energy, etc., that China can get from Myanmar. Also, though, Myanmar is incredibly strategically important for China because China's developing a port on the Bay of Bengal in Myanmar called Jiaopyu, and that gives them access to the Indian Ocean and allows them to avoid the shipments of energy coming to China and having to go through the Straits of Malacca, and so therefore vulnerable to being closed off by the US and its allies. So Myanmar is incredibly strategically important. So China has been pumping in vast amounts of infrastructure funding into Myanmar. So it's economically important, but at the same time, of course, Myanmar is chaotic now, and it's become an even more criminalised economy than in the past. And via these development of these new scam centres, etc., up on the borders, the China border, the Thai border, and so on, Myanmar has just become an extra problem for China because criminality, much of it originating in China, I hasten to add, but being exported into Myanmar, but then bouncing back into China. Many of the victims of these scam centres are Chinese. Many of the victims of the narcotics are in China as well. So I think China feels like they've got the tiger by the tail a bit. They're trying to support the military, but the military is just chaotic. It's allowed the development of this criminality. So China, in a sense, is now feeling the cost of this military regime. So at the moment, I think China's role is an odd one and an uncertain one. I think they're trying to shore up the regime. They're desperate for the regime to be a little bit more competent, a little bit more rational. But an uncomfortable ally, I would say, at the moment.
Absolutely. What do you think is the most likely trajectory of the Chinese position on Myanmar, especially if non-government forces were to take more control of the country or destabilize the regime even further?
Yeah, so I think in the end, China is opportunistic about Myanmar. So I think if it became clear that the opposition forces, the resistance forces were winning and were about to win, I think China would jump quite quickly basically in dumping the regime. And that's the thing that we're sort of looking for. They'd be a bit uncomfortable because I think China doesn't want a vibrant democracy on its borders. But at the same time, again, the chaos and the instability and the criminality of the regime that's there at the moment, I think has China really rethinking its position. And I think if it was clear that Myanmar could become more stable through a victory of the democratic resistance, China, I think, reluctantly would probably throw its weight behind it.
The way Southeast Asia is often discussed in the United States is in the context of great power competition between the U.S. and China. Are there any ways in which the new U.S. administration could collaborate with China for a more peaceful resolution to the situation in Myanmar, or do you see it being a highly competitive issue?
I think it's largely competitive. I think that there's potential, though, for some sort of collaboration over this issue of criminality and so on. So I think, and some of the best research on this whole issue, of course, has been done here in the US, at the US Institute for Peace, for instance. So that's probably the avenue through which I think both countries, that is both the US and China, could see similar interests, because they both have, I think, vested interests in Myanmar not becoming this giant, overtly criminal state.
And what sort of actions do you recommend on tamping down those criminal aspects that have everything to do from the scam centers to rampant drug production, myriad of issues? What kind of tangible actions can the United States take?
Well, I think the US is probably doing as much as it can, with the exception of extending the sanctions, as I mentioned earlier. And in that context too, the US sort of protects itself, right? Because the US doesn't want illicit money coming in from the Myanmar banking system, coming into the financial system here. So in some ways it's a self-protective measure. I think the onus is actually on China, because China, as I mentioned, is very concerned about these scam centres. So they have put pressure on the Myanmar regime to dampen them down a bit. But that's just caused the criminality to shift a bit down into Thailand, and actually the criminality visited upon then Thailand, but also exported around the world as well, because of course a lot of these scams are online and all that. So I think, the onus is on China, because it's shown that it can dampen down some of this criminality, but it's chosen not to do it when the criminality doesn't affect it so much. So I think China sort of recognising that the region becomes more stable, and therefore, in its own interest in the longer run too, needs to crack down a bit, because, again, most of these criminal gangs, even though they're over the border in Myanmar running these scam centres, most of them actually have their origins in China itself.
Yeah. So to talk potentially about a post-conflict future, and you've said that you're confident the regime will fall due to its unpopularity, its military losses, its economic weaknesses, and a myriad of other issues. What will the post-conflict reality look like, and what can international actors do to support a more peaceful Myanmar?
I'm quite optimistic about a post-junta Myanmar. Upon their collapse, and here I suppose a little caveat, I think for my optimism to work and be plausible, I think it needs the complete defeat of the military. So not some sort of awkward compromise, but if the military were to collapse completely, which is the most likely scenario, then I'm really quite optimistic. First, I think just a very practical thing, Myanmar has fallen so much, and it's man-made, and gender specific there. It's a man-made fall, so it can be man-made reversed. So the management of the economy, for instance, has been so bad that simply stopping the policies and activities of the military will cause a very strong bounce back. So, if I look at all the measures that are being taken by this SAC junta, if those measures were to simply be reversed, we would see, as I mentioned, like quite a strong bounce back. Then all sorts of other positive developments would come. But above all, the return fully into the economy of a cohort of young Burmese who are just so impressive. And I think that's the element through which my confidence is mostly based. I knew it at the time when I was working in Myanmar from 2006 to 2021, but post-coup, I'm just even more impressed. The young generation of Burmese people who took advantage of those open years from 2010 to 2020 to go out into the world, create new businesses, be educated in the West and within the region, and then bring the fruits of that back to Myanmar. You can really see it in the young generation, and plus their courage and all that we've seen. So, them being injected back, and of course, in the conflict, they've sacrificed so much, they're willing to do so much, but if that energy was to come back, then I can actually see the country really coming back. Likewise, even just intellectually, they know what to do. It's not rocket science. In fact, it's already been done. Under the previous government, the civilian government, we were working out plans for post-COVID reconstruction, for instance. And a lot of those policies, they're all ready to go. They're totally adaptable to a sort of post-junta economy. So for all those reasons, I'm confident in the longer run.
Great, yeah. Sort of my last policy question is about the complexities of creating a unified Myanmar state. What's been so elusive for the Burmese people is national unity across ethnic groups. Aung San was assassinated in 1947. As he tried to realize that goal, it's still not been achieved in the century since. If opposition elements in Myanmar were to get the upper hand and completely oust the SAC, what is the likelihood they could achieve full ethnic and national unity, and what would be the biggest barriers to that?
So I think the indications so far are quite positive on that front as well, and particularly if we compare back to the past. So I remember, the forces of democracy 2 decades ago, and I think they were much more divided than they are now. So I've been surprised, actually, the degree of unity between the various ethnic armies and the National Unity Government and, all the, I think, ethnic communities acting together. Having said that, though, there are still divisions. But I think, again, there's hope here, because one of the things I've noticed, again, amongst these new players, new generation, is an understanding that this whole issue of the divisions is front and centre, and it needs to be dealt with before anything else. And so I think, for instance, in previous years, what tended to happen, or the belief tended to be, let's try and fix Myanmar, lift the economy, the country becomes, wealthier, more prosperous, conflict over resources calms down, things like that. Then you can do the sort of justice to states and regions and come up with a sort of just fiscal federalism. Whereas I think now the understanding is, no, you can't leave the creation of a just federal framework for after. It's got to be right at the beginning of the reforms. So I draw quite a bit of confidence from that as well, that even in engaging on the economic reforms, they would begin on the basis of significant autonomy for the states and regions, and then from that base build upwards to a fiscal framework, like a federal framework.
Right.
It might be a weaker federal government, or it has less sway over different parts of the economy, but it might be a more unified federal government than has ever been the case in Myanmar before.
Are you seeing those signs between the various ethnic armed groups that they would be ready to come together and collaborate, or are there any actors that you feel, obviously other than the junta, wouldn't be able or be willing to come together for national ethnic unity?
Yeah. So I think mostly the signs are good, but there are some more awkward elements than others. So there's still a lot of work to be done. So I don't understand overly sanguine on it, but just to say that that the mood music over this issue is just so much better than it ever has been before. And the stakes are really high. And I think most people recognise that the one way through which the military can sort of come back from its reversals, etc., is sort of division, if you like, amongst all the resistance forces.
Yeah. Well, I hope that vision of a unified Myanmar and the hope in the younger generation, which I've truly been very inspired both by Burmese people I've known who are in Myanmar and the diaspora here. It's a good place to end our policy conversation. My truly last question for you is, in the book, you discuss conversations with fellow prisoners about, when we get out of here and they make the Hollywood movie about us, which actors are going to play us? And I have to ask you, has your thinking changed? Who right now are you hoping will play you in the movie about your life?
Wow, that's a really great question. Because when I spoke about that to my fellow prisoners, I said that I wanted Brad Pitt to play
Right.
me, because I found out in the prison, one of the other prisoners told me that Brad Pitt was about the same age as me, and so I said, "Oh, that's it. That's
Yeah.
decided who gets to play me."
Dead look-alike.
But I feared all along, though, you know, given my physicality and so on, that instead they would assign Danny DeVito. So I always feared that. So great question. So since I've come out, look, I think I'm still going to go for Brad Pitt.
Right.
For me. But there have been some new actors emerge. In casting the movie, I'd probably want to look at, you know, maybe the latest Academy Awards to see, who might fit the exact positions.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for coming in. I really recommend the book. It's a comedy, it's a tragedy, it's a love story, the support of your wife and the people that love you. And it's been a really great pleasure to get to speak to you today.
Meghan, the pleasure has been all mine, and it's just wonderful to be here at the Asia Society in New York City.
Right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.